Hello everyone, my name is Luke Cliffet. Today we will bring you a developing story regarding political psychology. In essence, how do our brains affect the way we think and therefore view the world in politics? Have you ever wondered, why in hell does a certain group of people support this policy? Today I will answer this question and maybe bring a little bit more tolerance to our very diverse political landscape. Let's get right into it. Political psychology, why do we think? Made and presented by your host, Luke Cliffet. What will I accomplish today? I will accomplish and cover the parts of the brain, how liberals' brains may differ from conservative brains, political, psychological, and political tendencies, political issues, political influence, and political sociology. I will cover all of that today, but our main focus here today will be political psychology and how that applies to other things such as sociology and how we act. Let's get right into the brain structure. So we have a very important part in our brain called the cerebrum. It pretty much occupies almost parts of the brain, and that cerebrum is split up into different lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which is responsible for motor function, thought, memory, behavior, etc. Very important in the world of politics. We also have another important lobe, which is the temporal lobe, part of the brain responsible for visual memory, language comprehension, and emotion association. We have the parental lobe responsible for sensory input, and then we have the occipital lobe, which takes the input and sends it down to the other parts of the body. In essence, if I want to move a finger, my occipital lobe would send that output to my finger, and my tendons moving it. So now that we've looked and know at the functions, let's see how that applies to the political landscape. Let's talk about the frontal lobe again. As stated previously, this lobe is responsible for motor function, which does not have a lot to do with politics, let's be honest, but it also has a lot to do with memory, behavior, and thoughts. This is very important with politics, and that's something that I will cover in a bit. We also have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is responsible for things such as emotion. This is important for emotionally driven topics such as abortion. So when you feel something in politics, if something disgusts you in politics, like how could this person be pro-life / pro-choice, that is because of the temporal lobe. And I will cover what differs in the temporal lobe in a second, but just give me some time here. In addition to this, the temporal lobe is also responsible for language comprehension. This may be why right-wingers enjoy rhyming poetry and why liberals tend to enjoy free verse. Moving on to the parietal lobe, this region of the brain is responsible for sensory, speech, touch, sensation, and also many other different things. Speech is pretty important when it comes to politics. It has been observed that Republicans have a more direct and anti-PC rhetoric, and this may be because of differences in the parietal lobe. I'll cover that a bit later when we go through the actual structure and what makes the difference in politics. Moving on to comparison and brain scans, the human brain is an ever-changing structure. According to the diagram, people of a party may have a more developed part of a brain than a different party. So for example, as you see up here, liberals tend to have a bigger or more developed anterior cingulate cortex, when Republicans may have a more developed amygdala. These are differences in the actual brain scans, and this may be why we have distinction in parties in politics. The right-wingers tend to have a more developed amygdala, and the left-wingers tend to have a more developed anterior cingulate cortex. With this said, Professor John Hibling states that neurologists can predict a individual's parties with an accuracy of 71.6%. That is no coin toss. 71.6% is a very, very good statistic. And that means just by looking at the brain, if you are a studying neurologist, you can probably predict one's party with an accuracy of 71.6%. That's groundbreaking. With this said, it is obvious that the brains are different depending on which parties one associates with, so let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's talk a bit about the liberal brains. Liberals are obviously the left-leaning, and liberals tend to have a more developed anterior cingulate cortex. This is a region in the brain, in the back of the brain, and this is responsible for understanding conflict and feelings of sympathy. Feelings of sympathy is crucial with politics because leftists are usually associated with feelings of sympathy. This feeling of sympathy is very important when observing politics because people on the left usually have a tendency to be caregivers and they usually have a tendency to feel overwhelming feelings of sympathy for others. This may be to contribute to opinions on policies such as deportation and capital punishment, which liberals tend to oppose. They tend to oppose people dying in capital punishment and people getting deported under the policy of deportation. Let's move on to the conservative brain. As I stated earlier, the amygdala is a big part of the brain commonly associated with Republicans. Conservatives are known to have a bigger amygdala, a part of the brain known to contribute to understanding emotions, survival instincts, and memory. These survival instincts are very, very crucial when understanding politics and psychology revolving around politics. For example, the survival instincts trait is crucial when understanding this on the right because it might be to blame for thoughts of my country, my money, my guns, etc. People on the right usually have a tendency to want to hold things and want to own things in politics. So for example, they want their money. They don't want to give it up with taxes or things like that. They want their country to be theirs. They don't want invaders to come inside of their country and be legally allowed to be citizens. They want to own guns, and this may be because of survival tactics. So now that we've talked about how liberals' brains may differ from conservative brains, let's talk about how their actions are different through the means of psychological tendencies. As we move on, liberals tend to enjoy food like sushi, although this might be because of ethics commonly associated with liberals such as veganism, when Republicans tend to enjoy food like meat and potatoes. Just a quick fact for you there. In addition to this, liberals tend to keep a messy house when conservatives tend to keep a clean house. With this said, liberals tend to have a higher IQ score than Republicans, with liberals averaging a 101 and Republicans averaging a 94. On the other hand of this though, conservatives have a lower crime rate, with only 10% of convicted criminals currently in jail or prison identifying with the Republican Party. Although I may suggest that this is because liberal policies apply to the poor and the socioeconomic class of poverty has a correlation to crime. Just a disclaimer. Now let's talk a bit about the right versus the left brain. The right versus the left brain is a theory about the brain dominance on which side of your brain is dominant, and therefore it has a correlation to how you act. So the left brain, as you can see, is more analytical, you're really into numbers and science, and the right brain is more revolved around imagination and creativity. So we'll cover that in a minute. But moving on, I actually conducted a poll on what topics are most important to the American people. I covered 16 different political policies put in place, and I wanted to know which 4 topics are most important to the American people. And then I can conduct a study on why these topics and policies are important to them. So I went on Instagram and I got about 70 voters for each poll inside of this bracket behind me, and I concluded that abortion, deportation, gun control, and capitalism v. socialism, otherwise known as more economic policy, these 4 policies are the most important to the American people. Now, I did not study which sides the majority of the American people are on, but I did conclude that we, the American people, are the most passionate about those 4 policies. Now moving on, we will cover those 4 policies in a minute, and I will conclude why people on the right versus people on the left are clashing about those 4 policies, and maybe why these people think in what way they do. So moving on, why are political issues so polarizing? Politics is a very diverse issue in America, with some states being very, very conservative and other states being very, very liberal. For example, California is very, very liberal, when Texas and Alabama are very, very conservative. So why are these states so different? Well, some of it comes down to nurture, experience, and influence. So for example, people in Alabama have been raised on conservatism for a long, long time, and as generations go through, the parents teach the kids about conservative values, and it just gets passed on. And that's why most of the time people in Alabama or Texas are conservative, and that's the same for California on the left. but also it has been proven that a little bit is actually hereditary. So for example, brain scans have concluded that for example, amygdala can be about the same amount of developed as your parent. So if your amygdala is very, very big, you are more than likely to be conservative. And if your parent passes down that trait to you, you might have a higher chance of being conservative than liberal. So now that we've talked about polarization, let's go to the topics on policies. We will cover right versus left brain thinking, and if some people on the left versus some people on the right think right versus left brain, and we will also cover parts of the brain revolved around each policy. So let's go right to deportation. Deportation is basically can be defined by somebody being forcefully removed from a country. This typically is done in America because they illegally enter the country, therefore they will be forcefully removed if convicted. Liberals don't usually oppose this policy, but they do critique associations that do it, otherwise known as ICE, and they also oppose mass deportation. So they wouldn't want to see 10,000 illegal immigrants all deported on the same day because they may find that unfair. While the conservatives just really want these illegal immigrants out of the country. So parts of the brain responsible for this thought, on the left, it goes back to the anterior cingulate cortex because it has feelings of trust and sympathy revolved around that part of the brain. If you trust these people because of your brain, you're going to say, hey, they can stay in our country. And also, you have feelings of sympathy, overwhelming feelings of sympathy if you are a liberal. Therefore, hey, I don't think it's right for these people to be kicked out of the country. While conservatives have a larger and more developed amygdala, which has been associated with survival tactics, hence my country. I don't want these illegal immigrants coming to my country because I don't feel it is necessary, and honestly, that I'm a citizen and they are not. So right versus left brain thinking. We covered that a little bit ago. Again, left brain thinking is more analytical and right brain thinking is more imaginative and creative. Both are very good characteristics to have, but there is a distinction between the left versus the right brain and liberals versus conservatives. So in this particular policy, I would make the claim that liberals are right brain because they have immense amounts of sympathy and feelings for these people, while conservatives are left brain because they are analytical and a little bit more logical. If you look at the statistics, illegal immigrants cost a lot of money for the US government, and that is not good. So moving on, in my personal opinion, this is the most hot topic in America right now. Some states have zero regulations on this and other states regulate it so heavily. This is abortion. Abortion is the method of a removal of a child from the mother's uterus because of the mother's command, and it results in the death of the unborn baby. Liberals tend to rely on scientific arguments, and some could make the argument and the claim that the fetus is entirely dependent on the mother, and therefore it is definitionally not a life. While conservatives tend to value religion, and it is a religious argument to make that these children are the children of God and therefore they should not be killed. But I have to make the claim that they also have some facts with their argument as well, because they argue that this child should not be killed because the definition of life should not be dependent on geographical location. So, parts of the brain responsible for thinking, I couldn't find any parts of the brain that correlate to their personal views for this particular topic. And also, let's cover right versus left brain thinking. I would say the left is more left brain thinking on this particular argument because they rely on scientific and analytical arguments. But then again, I feel the right has an overwhelming feelings of sympathy for these unborn children, therefore they are right brain thinking. In my personal opinion, those are both very good characteristics to have, and this is such a good debate to make because these arguments are so set in stone and so amazing. It's probably the best political debate you could ever have in politics. So let's move on to gun policy. Gun policy is obviously, should we restrict the amount of guns and the guns that the people should have? So should the government be able to take away a military grade weapon from the average citizen? And obviously, in current day America, the Second Amendment provides the right to